The subject of foreign entanglements is something that to many people seems, well, rather boring, or perhaps they've never even heard about it. So we want to set the mood by asking some questions first before we actually get into the subject. For instance, how many of you have ever bought a product and then found out that it wasn't as advertised? That happens once in a while, doesn't it? But when it comes to politicians, it happens far too frequently. That what we hear from a politician is not what we get once they're elected. And that's the way treaties and trade agreements fit the pattern as well. What's on the title isn't necessarily what's in the body of the agreement. Before we move forward, we need to take in the adage of the British nobleman Lord Acton. And he said that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There are some other principles of government that we have to keep in mind. For instance, powerful government always ignores the rights of the people. There is no exception to that. Also, power continues to accumulate more power until it's stopped. Powerful government always wants more and more and more until the people put a stop to it. But even when they put a stop to it, the government never fully relinquishes power back to the people that it assumed. Now there's an exception to that, and that's George Washington. He had total power in our country at one time as Commander-in-Chief of our Army. He gave that up. He assumed the presidency after being elected, and he gave that up. He assumed power again as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army under the Adams administration, and he gave that up. He was offered to be King of the United States. He didn't want it. He was a man that did not want that kind of power or to set that kind of precedent. And he gave us a lot of very good advice about how to run a government. And a lot of that advice was contained in his farewell address, and this quote is from that speech. He said, "'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with a portion of the foreign world." Now, he didn't mean a specific portion, he meant any portion of the foreign world. Jefferson likewise said, "Commerce with all nations, alliance with none, shall be our motto." And 2 years later, he said, "I deem the essential principles of our government peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." Now, let's take a look at what the function of government is. Now, one of the things that is so important in the function of government is almost always left out of any discussion, and that is, it is the first necessity of our government to maintain our independence, to keep our country free from foreign alliances and foreign entanglements, where they come in and have a say over what we do in our government, in our economy, and everything else. That's the first job of government, is to maintain our independence. Secondly, it's to protect God-given rights. You know, when we do study government in school, we all did, the first document we studied was what? It was the Declaration of Independence. And then we went into how the country was formed and so on and so forth. But the Declaration of Independence set down the basic philosophy of our government, which said that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So it's the job of government to protect those God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. The government was not established to regulate business. It was not established to form permanent alliances. And it was not established to abrogate the Constitution. Yet today, what do we see? Almost on a daily basis, these things are being done against the general nature of our system of government. Let's ask some more questions. When has a government agency created since 1933 solved the problem it was created to solve? Well, the answer is none. What government agency has ever gone out of business because the reason it was created disappeared? Again, the answer is none. Now, there are a couple of agencies that took the name off the door and seemed to go out of business, but they were slid into other agencies, such as the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration slipped in underneath the Justice Department, but it didn't go out of business. Just the name came off the door. Another thing is, how can you believe that under the current conditions our government can solve free trade issues? Look, they haven't solved the war on terror, they haven't solved the war on drugs, they haven't solved the war on poverty, they can't solve the immigration problem, so what makes us think that they're going to be able to solve trade issues? The government has a number of solutions for trade and a poor economy, and that is free trade. Constantly, that's the answer. If we've got a poor economy, we need free trade. If it gets worse, we need more free trade. And if the economy would collapse, I'm sure they would say we need universal free trade. Now, how about free enterprise solutions? How about reducing the size of government, decreasing regulation, and decreasing taxation? Those things would stimulate the economy and make the economy rise, and more jobs would be produced, more businesses would be produced, but instead they give us the solution of what they call free trade. Now, let's ask another question. Is our government moving towards socialism? Now, I've never had anybody disagree with that. All of them say, everywhere I've been, audiences all over the country, they agree, yes, our government's moving towards socialism. Why would our foreign policy, therefore, be any different? You know, it would be the same people that implement both policies, right? They implement domestic policy where they're moving us towards socialism. So why would we think that their foreign policy would be any different no matter what they put on as a label of that policy? Freedom, democracy, all the rest of it. Ladies and gentlemen, the sad story is that our government's moving towards socialism overseas as well. It's the same people implementing both policies, isn't it? Now, we find that free trade pacts, and this is being generous, are 20% trade and 80% changes in climate control, sustainable development, homeland security, our military, international courts, banking regulations, that sort of thing. And that's what you find in these trade agreements, more than trade. The question that we'd like to ask is, why are there so many pages in these trade agreements? NAFTA had 2,000 pages. And the answer is because they deal with issues that have nothing to do with trade. Now, the Constitution, the contract that binds an entire complex government and scores of states together, was written on 4 pages, about this size. Now, those 4 pages were then transcribed into the larger document that you see on display in Washington, D.C. How about a trade agreement that was only 1 page instead of 2,000 pages? That simply said at the top, we the undersigned agree not to interfere with our businessmen doing business with your businessmen. That's free trade. Now let's take a look at the promises of trade and the trade agreements and then their results. Let's take a look first at China. They said that we'd have consumer benefits. In other words, we'd go to Walmart and Safeco and Target and buy cheaper goods, and that'd leave more money in our pocket for us to go out and buy other stuff. You know, Americans like stuff, right? So that was appealing. The other thing they said was that because of all these products built in China, it would build up a new class of people in China that put these things together in these manufacturing plants and the general industry. They, because they'd have more money in their pocket from their wages, would be able to buy the goods from the United States that we export from here to China. Now, how did that work out? Well, it didn't work out at all, did it? And they also said that trade would produce peace. Well, let's take a look at the results. First of all, our industry moved to China, and along with it, the jobs. China started to buy up commercial real estate and building developments in the United States with your money. Not only that, they're starting now to buy up the food chain. They bought heavily into the chicken and pork industries, and they're literally, as I said, buying up the food chain of the United States. The Bank of China is now the largest foreign lender in the United States with your money. And they're now discussing converting the foreign exchange reserves into American real estate and other hard assets. That's The Chinese come in, they start buying up businesses and everything, and that'll stimulate the local economy, and everybody will be happy for a little while anyway. But let me pose another question to you. Who runs the local economy? Who runs the local government? It's the business community, isn't it? If the Chinese come in and start to buy up your business community, who's going to be running your local government after a while? The Chinese. Further results of trade with China is that we've provided them the money by buying their goods to build up their military. Now, of course, they're pushing their weight around now in the Pacific, which is not making the Japanese and the Filipinos and the Vietnamese very happy. In fact, now they're trying to encroach on their territorial rights and their territory. They're buying up strategic minerals. We sent people into harm's way in Afghanistan and Iraq, and today the Chinese are reaping the minerals and the oil and other things out of those countries. We went in and we paid dearly to do these things, and yet the Chinese come behind and reap the rewards. It's even provided them the money to give loans to Latin American governments. In fact, you could use the word bribes, because what's been happening in Latin America is that it's going communist. It's going communist because of the influence of the Chinese and their money that we've given them. Now, I invite all of you to go online and look up governments in Latin America, and then go to Wikipedia and see what party is in control of those governments and see what that party is. You'll discover that there's only about 4 countries left in Latin America that today are not ruled by communists. Some of them are ex-terrorists. Let's look at NAFTA and the promises and the results. It said we'll have prosperity. It lowered our economy. They said we'd have more jobs. We got higher unemployment. As a matter of fact, we lost at least 1 million employees in the industrial sector of the United States through NAFTA alone, with businesses leaving the country as a result. They said we'd have less illegal immigration. So we were having about 100,000, well, at least hundreds of thousands of people crossing the border before we passed NAFTA. After we passed NAFTA, it became millions each year. They said we'd have better relations with our neighbors. Well, I'll give that one to them, because what they tried to do with the NAFTA agreement was to form a North American Union. The NAFTA agreement actually served as the platform to try that, to merge the United States, Canada, and Mexico into one country. We'll get into that more in a moment. It also gave us a NAFTA court that few people have ever heard about. Former Congressman Mikva, who is a judge in the NAFTA court, at least when he said this statement, he said if Congress had known there was anything like this in NAFTA, they would never have voted for it, unquote. Now, I invite all of you to go to the New York Times of April 18, 2004, and look up this article. That is probably the most comprehensive article ever written about the NAFTA court. Now, let me give you just one edict of the NAFTA court that should kind of give you an idea of what can come as a result of this new court. They had an edict which said basically that it was unfair trade practice not to allow Mexican truck drivers and trucks on U.S. highways. And well, that caused quite a furor, because what they were saying is that the Mexican companies now could come in and compete with American companies and push the American truckers out of business. Now, it wasn't implemented, and it wasn't implemented because it caused such a problem with the Teamsters Union, for instance, and a lot of trucking companies. And they said, no way. So it's still on the books. It's still waiting to be implemented when it's politically expedient to do so. Now, the NAFTA court supersedes any state Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court. There is no appeal from it. We have no place, nowhere to go to appeal an edict from the NAFTA court. It also forces American businessmen before the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. And I'd also invite you to go online and look for Project on International Courts and Tribunals. And you can see even more courts as a result of foreign entanglements that supersede the American Supreme Court. We no longer have control even over our courts through these entangling alliances. Now, who benefits from these foreign entanglements, these free trade agreements? First of all, the multinational corporations and international banks, they benefit because they are what are known as stakeholders, and they are invited in on the negotiations. Now, the American people aren't invited in. The American Congress isn't invited in. In fact, we nor the Congress even know what's going on in these negotiations, but multinational corporations and international banks do. Now, who do you think is going to benefit from such an agreement? They will, and it will push out their competition from the small and medium-sized businesses and banks. They will atrophy under these agreements, and that's what's been going on. You see fewer and fewer banks, and fewer small businesses, and larger and larger corporations. Government will also benefit from it because it will expand government. It will create new bureaucracies, new courts, and everything else. Government people love that because then it brings in more employees underneath them, and they get hiked up in their standing and higher salaries and everything else. And the ultimate beneficiary of these agreements is international government itself, because it sets up more and more international government under the United Nations. Now let's pause here and look at what free trade really is. And we need to add another word to free trade if we're going to talk about what we think of as free trade, and that's the word equitable. Is it equitable for free trade? Now, Dr. Lewis E. Lloyd, several years ago, was a free trade advocate. He worked for it. He promoted it. But then one day he had a paradigm shift and realized, wait a minute, there are some things involved in free trade that we have to look at for it to be equitable. In other words, we have something in our mind when we think of free trade. But let's put the word equitable in front of it, and that defines it even better. And he said there were 8 things that need to be done in order to have equitable free trade. First of all, taxes must be comparable. You can imagine trade between a country that has high taxes and one that has low taxes. Guess who wins in that trade swap? It's the one with the lower taxes. A single monetary system must be in use. Now, what is the monetary system that's used all over the world? It's paper, ladies and gentlemen. You can put any nomenclature on it that you want to, but essentially it's paper. It's just pieces of paper with different printing on it. That is the monetary system used by everyone. Now, that being the case, if there is a trade agreement between one or more nations and they've all got printing presses, now they can either speed up the printing press and inflate the currency, or they can retard the speed of the printing press and slow it down and create deflation. And in any case, that would make any trade agreement that was signed at any moment inequitable because of the speed of their printing presses. It's that simple. 3, there must be uniform business laws. If you have a country that has all sorts of regulations like OSHA and the EPA and so on and so forth, and another country that does not, then you see that's not going to be equitable either. China, for instance, has very few regulations on its industry, so they besmog their cities, they pollute their rivers. We don't do that, and so we can't compete against an industry that is not regulated to the level that we're regulated. Similar business ethics must prevail. There's a law in the United States that says we cannot pay a bribe to anybody inside the country or outside the country in order to do business. And yet we know there are countries where you can't do business unless you pay a bribe. So you have to have similar business ethics in order for it to work. There must be uniform wage rates. If you have a country that pays $15 an hour to turn a screw and another country that pays 50 cents to turn a screw, guess who wins? It doesn't work. Maximum labor mobility must exist across borders so that as situations change in the economy and so forth, labor can move around and make up the differences that need to be made up. There must be freedom from the threat of war. War will always destroy an economy, and it will always destroy any kind of trade. It just stops. And lastly, all the above would have to be enforced by world government. You'd have to have some form of government to enforce all of this. Now, other than 8, if you take out 8 from this equation, there is a place on earth where this does exist. It's called the United States. You see, but all of this is enforced by our Constitution and the Congress. But if it was enforced by a world government, if we did it on an international scale, what we'd be stuck with is a government that's full of corruption, socialists, communists, that sort of thing. And you don't have to prove it any more than going to the United Nations General Assembly and looking at how they vote. It is extremely rare that the General Assembly of the United Nations votes with the United States. They vote against us constantly, and it would be the same in any kind of a universal trade agreement enforced by a world government, or even a regional agreement also enforced by the United Nations. It would be inequitable rather than equitable. Now, let's take a look at foreign entanglements without the ratification of a formal treaty. The most famous one in that regard is what is called Agenda 21. Now, in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, they held the United Nations Conference on Environmental and Development, or what they nicknamed the Earth Summit. And out of that came an agenda they called Agenda 21. And that was simply because it's what they wanted to do in the 21st century. Now, it was just one aspect of this general conference, but it basically was a scheme to bring local governments into the sphere of the United Nations, percolating up from the bottom with regulations over the environment instead of by treaty from the top down. So it was kind of a pincers movement on the people of the world, particularly the United States. Now, Agenda 21 formed what they called the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. This says it all. It's an international council. It's not an American council. It's not a European council. It's an international council. It's ruled primarily through the United Nations. And it is to get local government involved in environmental initiatives in order to control local property. That's what it's all about. In other words, when you control the environment, what do you control? You don't really control the environment. Can anybody here control nature? I don't think so. You're not controlling the environment. You're controlling the people who use water, who use land, and that sort of thing. It's a way in the name of the environment to get control of the people. And they are doing it through local governments. And a lot of people are not aware that this is going on in their city council or their county commissioners and that sort of thing. Now, they have a website, ICLEI does. And you can go to that website and find out what towns and counties or local segments of government all around the world are members of ICLEI, except the United States. You see, the John Birch Society has caused so much trouble for Agenda 21 that local citizens are going online to ICLEI and seeing whether or not their community is a member of ICLEI. And when they find out that it is, they band together with other local citizens, and they've been getting their local council and their local commission out of ICLEI. So now they'll tell everybody around the world who's a member of ICLEI except the citizens of the United States. They've taken down the specific cities and counties that they once had up there so that the local citizens can't find out. So then they can't do anything because they don't know. At any rate, they're now even trying to change the name of the organization. They're using such things, such language as Local Governments for Sustainability. Let's take a look at the European Union. The European Union is simply Hitler's plan as implemented through Albert Speer for a united Europe. In fact, they called it the European Economic Community, translated into English. And the motto was one European state, one currency, and one central bank. And yet 10 years after the defeat of Nazism in Europe, we find out that the International Socialists put together a system to start uniting Europe, which they called, guess what, the European Economic Community, the same name as Albert Speer's program. Now, this was all done by subterfuge. The socialist governments negotiated the European Union. All of these countries had, at one time, and usually the majority of these countries at any time, had socialist governments. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember this gentleman, he was known as Mr. Socialist. And his name was Paul-Henri Spaak. He was the Prime Minister of Belgium. And he pretty much outlined what they were trying to do. He said the most effective way to disguise their political purpose, and this is involved the political purpose of the European Union, is to conceal it behind a pretense that it is concerned only with economic cooperation based on dismantling trade barriers, a common market, unquote. Bernard Conley is a former senior official in the European Commission. He found out what it was by working at the top in the European Union, and he gave us this quote. He said, "It has now become clear to us that what we thought was a common market is nothing more than a project to create a European federal superstate in which our sovereignty, Britain's national identity, would be extinguished." Now, the European Union's in trouble. It needs cash. And they've got a lot of countries like Italy and Spain and Greece that they need to bail out. So where are they going to get this money? Well, they're looking across the Atlantic to something called the Federal Reserve. As a matter of fact, we know that the Federal Reserve is already bailing out the EU, but they want to do it without having to go through any subterfuge. So they're looking at the United States to be brought into the European Union. Now, whether or not you believe that, let me tell you another little story from personal experience. Back when the Berlin Wall came down, myself and another individual went to Europe representing the New American Magazine. And while we were there, we had interviews with all sorts of people in the German cabinet, publishers, politicians, students on the street, civil servants. We interviewed even East German army officers who were communists, and they said that yeah, the wall's coming down, but what they're going to do is infiltrate into the West until they become strong enough and then just take it over. And one interview that we had that was very important, particularly to this subject, was we went into the public relations office of the EC, as it was known at that time, the European Community, just a few months before they changed it to the EU, and met with the public relations director in Bonn, Germany. And he looked at me across his desk and said that when we get this together, meaning the EU, he says, we're going to be bigger than you geographically, and we're going to be bigger than you economically. And we're going to drag the United States into this union, kicking and screaming if necessary. And I thought, that's kind of arrogant. And then my second thought was, well, here we are, we're in there representing the New American Magazine, certainly the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they've been in here too. And he must have said pretty much the same thing to them. Why haven't I been reading this in these mainstream newspapers? Well, the answer is that these newspapers' editorial policy is the involvement of the United States in these foreign entanglements, ultimately into the European Union. As a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal came right out in the open at one point and said that we are for the merger of the United States, Mexico, and Canada into one country. They don't want any borders between any of the countries in Europe, and now that's the condition that exists. As a libertarian kind of a guy, that sounds appealing. I don't want to have to cross all these borders and show my passport and have my luggage searched and all the rest of the things that go with it possibly. And so it's appealing, no borders. But there are some problems with no borders, and particularly with the Constitution of the European Union, because what's happening is that the elderly in certain countries are moving to England to go on their Social Security. Now, they've never paid a nickel into the English Social Security system, but they're there now drawing on that Social Security system. Now, the English, understandably, are upset, and they're trying to put a stop to this, but they can't, because that's the law in Europe now under the European Union. Anybody can move anywhere within the system. So what's happening is that the unstable countries that have lost their retirements or didn't have any retirement program to begin with are moving into countries that do and are destabilizing those countries. So there are problems with no borders, okay, that most people don't realize at first. They even get down into deciding what the fees should be on the channel. The English and French built a tunnel under the English Channel, and they got together and they decided these are the fees that we're going to have to institute in order to maintain this channel. Well, the European Union came to them and said, no, you're going to have to lower your fees so that more people will use the channel. I guess to go over and get on English Social Security. Now, in the European Union, the member states, the citizens of Europe, were not allowed to vote on the European Constitution. Now, at first they promised that, and they allowed France and the Netherlands to put it up for a vote. And the French and the Dutch turned it down. So they said, time out, we've obviously got to rewrite the Constitution because it's not being accepted by the people. So they went to Lisbon in 2007 and formulated a new treaty. Then they ratified it, and then they called it the Constitution. So no citizen of Europe was ever allowed to vote for their own constitution. It was imposed on them from the top down. Now, it also subordinated every country to the European Union, and at the same time subordinated every European country to the United Nations. I invite anyone to go online and read the European Union's Constitution and verify that fact. They have lost control over their own lives, their own country. The EU was sold to the British people as a trading agreement and has turned into a political union which has changed our basic laws and traditions, said Mike Nattrass, who is an official in the United Kingdom Independence Party, which the last election, before this was videoed, polled more votes than any other party, including the normal Tory and Labour parties, because they want to get out of the European Union, and the English are fed up with it. And like he said, it was sold to them as a trading agreement. So the European Union is one European Union, one currency, and one central bank. Basically the motto of Albert Speer and Hitler smiles. They did it without firing a shot, by subterfuge, by calling it trade. Now, before we discuss the new trade partnerships currently under negotiation, we need to discuss another aspect of NAFTA, because NAFTA was the first step for an initiative nicknamed the North American Union. Back in March 23rd of 2005, the three leaders of North America, Mexico, United States, and Canada got together and formulated something that they called the Security and Prosperity Partnership. Now, this is the home page, as it was originally, online for the Security and Prosperity Partnership. It was spp.gov. It was an official government website. Now, to reiterate, this became known as the North American Union, but its official name was the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And if you went to that website, you would see that they wanted a common tariff. In other words, common taxing for all three countries. They wanted a common border, with no border between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In other words, the border would be in the water around the three states, except across the land border between Guatemala and Mexico. That would be the only land border. Otherwise, no border between the United States and Mexico or the United States and Canada. By the way, in addition to that, they also said they want free flow of labor and that kind of thing. There would be no stopping anybody crossing the borders. They wanted a common law enforcement and army. In other words, a cooperation and interchange of personnel for police and army. They also wanted to integrate immediately medical services, environmental regulations, banking regulations, etc., to be put in place by 2010. Now, it didn't happen because primarily the John Birch Society stopped that from happening because of a massive education program that we instituted. A lot of people don't realize one of the key reasons why these internationalists need Obamacare, or the Affordable Health Care Act. It's because you can't merge free enterprise with socialism. It doesn't work. One of the two have to go. Now, all these other countries have socialized medicine. We had a free system. So now we're changing our system into a socialist system to be able to merge the two. That is one of the primary aspects of Obamacare that people don't understand. It's also what's happened in the banking field as well recently by reducing the number of banks, so on and so forth. All these things are being done to comfortably merge us into these foreign entanglements. Now, one of the entanglements that they've got under negotiation right now is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Simply put, it's a NAFTA for the Pacific area. It would set up the same thing in North America that happened in the Pacific area. And we will have one vote in this partnership. If it follows all other agreements, the next step will be an attempt to set up a multinational government, just like they attempted to do with and are doing silently behind the scenes with NAFTA. The other one that they're negotiating is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This literally is an attempt to merge us with the European Union. There's no question about that. Now, let's look at what some of the individuals who support these things have to say about these agreements. This is not the opponents, these are the proponents. Karl de Groot, he's one of the European Commissioners for Trade on the European Commission. In February of 2013, he said this: "A future deal between the world's two most important economic powers will be a game changer. Together, we will form the largest free trade zone in the world. This deal will set the standard not only for our future bilateral trade and investment, but also for the development of global rules." In the Council on Foreign Relations magazine, Tyson Marca in Foreign Affairs said this: "In the broadest terms, a U.S.-EU trade deal would allow the United States and Europe to maintain their sovereignty over global economic governance." I didn't realize there was any sovereignty over global economic governance. "Both realize that their ability to set global rules," there's that phrase again, "will diminish as economic power shifts to the Asia-Pacific region in the coming decade. No one power will be able to drive the international agenda." Did you know there was an international agenda? "But if they join forces, the United States and Europe can channel their combined economic weight to keep control of the reins of the global economic order." Ladies and gentlemen, pure and simple rules are not free trade. And all these people are talking about establishing rules. Another partnership that we need to talk about is a charter for American-Russian partnership and friendship, which was signed in 1992 by George H.W. Bush and the Russian government. Bill Clinton did the same thing, and again, later in 2002, George W. Bush said, "We are achieving a new strategic relationship. The era in which the United States and Russia saw each as an enemy or strategic threat has ended. We are partners, and we will cooperate to advance stability, security, and economic integration, and to jointly counter global challenges and to help resolve regional conflicts." And this is the sort of thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that when Putin refers to the United States as our partners, this is what he's talking about. That happened in the Snowden affair, when he said he didn't want to do anything to upset our American partners. And no one knew what he was talking about. This is what he was talking about. George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush all signed agreements with the Russian government to be partners. And if you look at it, it says economic integration, and they mean literally that, economic integration. If you go online and look up the major American industrial giants like General Electric, Boeing, Lockheed, General Motors, etc., you'll find that they are integrating their research and development and production into the factories in Russia and China. It's becoming a real danger to the future of the defense of the United States. And it's all being done out of the White House through these partnerships and calling for economic integration. Now, I don't always like quoting Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but he did say some things that I think are kind of important. He said, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. Ladies and gentlemen, people come up with ideas. People organize ideas. People finance ideas. Any idea that something in politics is an accident is just so ludicrous and beyond common sense. They are planned that way. I also like to quote Mark Twain. He says, the only difference between reality and fiction is that fiction needs to be credible. And we're talking about some pretty incredible things here, and we will be getting into other things that are even more incredible. This is the first time I can find that Marx and Engels used this term. Now, it's not the first time this term that I'm going to quote to you has been used. It's been used for many years by individuals that wanted to rule us. But this is the first time that I ever found Marx and Engels using it, and it was in the Holy Family in February of 1845, 3 years before they wrote the Communist Manifesto. They said this: the revolutionary movement, which began in 1789 in the Cercle Social, gave rise to the communist idea of the New World Order. The communist idea of the New World Order. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to go online and look up Cercle Social. If you want to know more about American history that you had no idea of, start spending a few hours online looking up Cercle Social and the individuals involved in it and how that had a lot of influence on the United States very early in our history. At first, you'll only come across some superficial things, but dig and dig and dig, and your eyes will be opened as to a lot of influence that came into the United States from these types of people very early in our history. Some of the people that use this term, well, H.G. Wells, who was a big leader in the socialist movement of England. You know, he wrote Time Machine, War of the Worlds. He also wrote the book, The New World Order, where he said socialism is unavoidable and advocated a world government. Fidel Castro demanded a new world order when he gave his talk before the General Assembly of the United Nations. Also, when Gorbachev visited Reagan at the Reagan Ranch, he urged a new world order, according to the Milwaukee Sentinel. And the Soviet president calls for a U.S. as partner to work toward goal. There's that word, partnership again, between us and the Soviet Union or Russia now. A year after Gorbachev visited Reagan at the Reagan Ranch, George H.W. Bush formulated the official policy of the United States in the National Security Strategy of the United States in August of 1991. I have this book in my library, and if you go to the preface, it says, A New World Order, signed by George H.W. Bush. This is the official foreign policy of the United States since that time. A lot of people want to impeach Obama. That's come and gone, come and gone. And I look at people when they advocate that and I say, well, you like Biden better? And they don't realize that Joseph Biden's been involved in this New World Order business for quite some time, long before Obama ever became a household word. In the Wall Street Journal for April 23rd, 1992, he wrote an article, How I Learned to Love the New World Order. He got on the floor of the Senate and gave a series of speeches about how we needed to go into a new world order, which means the abrogation of our Constitution and the loss of our independence. And he loved his words so much that he had compiled them all into a booklet called On the Threshold of the New World Order. And I've got this in my library as well. These individuals who are at the pinnacle of our government are working for a new world order. Even the Chinese have gotten into the act of the use of this term. A few days after 9/11, the China Daily said this: "This makes it more urgent that the international community move to wage an all-out war on terrorism by, in the final analysis, establishing a new world order that can ensure lasting peace." So we see that basically the President of the United States established a policy of a new world order. And there are other organizations around the country that support not only the new world order, but the merger of the United States into Europe. Here are just 6 of them. There are many, many of them. But the World Federalists, the United Nations Association, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Council, and the Transatlantic Policy Network. Now, David Rockefeller was the Council on Foreign Relations chairman of the board for 15 years. He wrote a book, well, he didn't write it, but he issued it under his name, his autobiography called Memoirs in 2002. And he said this, about page 405, somewhere in there. He said, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it." Now, here was the man who was chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations for 15 years. What about the influence of the Council on Foreign Relations? Just how far does it extend? How powerful is it? This is the Oval Office under George W. Bush, and every individual standing there is a current or former Secretary of Defense and State. Every one of them is a member at that moment of the Council on Foreign Relations. The only one in the photograph who is not was George W. Bush, and yet his father, George H.W. Bush, was a director on the board of directors of the Council on Foreign Relations. So basically, he was just following in his father's footsteps. Let's talk about the word partnership, because that's what's in these new negotiated agreements, the word partnership. It is a very pregnant word. It means something. It means a merger of certain aspects of the economy at the minimum. When you think of the term partnership, divorce it from these agreements and just think about that word itself. What does that mean to you? It means merger. And it's conformity to the points of Dr. Lloyd. It's just to remind you of what those were. These have to be done in order to form these partnerships. It also is nation building, because it's going to be controlled by an international body. It's not going to be controlled by the United States. It's not going to be controlled by England. It's not going to be controlled by Germany or anything of that nature. It will be an international body that comes onto the scenes to control it under the authority of the United Nations, because everything that we've done since we've joined the United Nations has been in compliance with it. We cannot have any kind of an international agreement without coming under the control of the Security Council and or General Assembly of the United Nations. It also further emerges in the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, using our own money to build the power there. Now, let's take a look for a moment at the problem of being involved in the United Nations. The United Nations gives rights by government. In other words, the United Nations says, you have rights. We are bestowing rights on you. We are guaranteeing these rights. But our government is based on the philosophy that our rights come from God and that no government can take them away or control them. Now, if you take a look at the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it gives rights and then states, these rights and freedom may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So you can have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, as long as it doesn't violate in any way contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. What does our Bill of Rights say? It says Congress shall not pass any law that curtails the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It doesn't matter whether it has anything to do with what they believe or not believe. Here, they try and control it. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations in Article 14 says, Everyone shall be entitled to a fair and public hearing. Then declares the press and public may be excluded from all or part of a trial for reasons of morals, public order, etc. Article 18, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, but then later asserts, freedom to manifest one's religions or belief may be subject to such limitation as are prescribed by law and are necessary. That's not freedom. That's control. In Article 21, it purports to guarantee the right of peaceable assembly, then permits the state to limit this right for national security or public safety, public order, the protection of public health or morals. What dictator couldn't drive a truck through that door? So you see, their idea of what is people's rights and their idea is what they will allow the people to have. We say our whole government is based on the idea of protection of God-given rights. Huge difference. Now, the United States Senate ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights with only 3 senators present. A few senators wrote letters of support or indicated their support. Now, what happened was that J. Rockefeller had the gavel in the Senate. And the senators thought that business for the day was over, and they trickled out over time. And nobody noticed the gavel didn't come down until only 3 senators were left. And one of those senators proposed the adoption of the covenant. And so J. Rockefeller brought it up for a vote, and he counted the votes. It was unanimous, all 3, and now it became the law of the land, according to Daniel Moynihan, who wasn't there but supported the idea. He said it will now become the binding international obligations of the United States. So you see, that's the thinking that a lot of people have, is that treaties supersede the Constitution of the United States. Now, there are a lot of treaties that we have passed or under negotiation that affect a broad spectrum of our society. And we're not going to go through all of these, but just point out that they involve fundamental rights, banking, economic and monetary policy, trade, industry, education, women, birth control, abortion, population control, labor, private ownership of firearms, oceans and their tributaries, courts that can supersede American courts, agriculture, environment, even tourism. We've involved ourselves in foreign entanglements that supersede our own regulations, our own laws, or our own freedoms in all of these regards. Now, the idea that a treaty gives the right to the United Nations to abrogate our Bill of Rights is ludicrous. I say that only a fool or an international socialist would say so, and yet Moynihan thought so. Why did he think such a thing? Because our founders didn't think so. Jefferson said, I say the same as to the opinion of those who consider the grant of treaty-making power as boundless. If it is, then we have no Constitution. Madison said pretty much the same thing. Hamilton said a treaty cannot be made which alters the Constitution of the country or which infringes any express exceptions to the power of the Constitution of the United States. Now, do treaties supersede the Constitution? To enact a law, both the Senate and the House of Representatives must vote for it. To amend the Constitution, both the Senate and the House of Representatives must vote for it, and the states get involved in the process. It makes no sense, therefore, that treaties supersede the Constitution if the House of Representatives does not vote for treaties. Now, we're talking about trade agreements, but ladies and gentlemen, they're being implemented as if they are treaties once they are passed. And so the question has to come up, well, then why are the individuals in the House of Representatives voting for these trade treaties? There's 2 reasons. First of all, it mandates in the Constitution that both houses regulate commerce, you see. And so in the regulation of commerce, that involves these free trade treaties. The other reason is this. If at some time we come to our senses and realize that these free trade treaties are a problem, if the House didn't vote on them, we could simply say they're illegal because the House didn't vote on them, because the House is also supposed to be involved in the process of regulating commerce. So that's why the House is voting on these treaties, if you will. No matter what they are called, they are treaties in the real sense of being implemented. Now, we did not believe in this idea that treaties superseded the Constitution until after we joined the United Nations. And then suddenly, a number of people in very high positions started to give us this idea that, wait a minute, treaties supersede the Constitution. Here, for instance, John Foster Dulles was a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations and a future Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration. He said before a regional meeting of the American Bar Association in Louisville, Kentucky in 1952, this: "Treaties make international law, and they also make domestic law. Under our Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land. Treaties, for example, can take powers away from the Congress and give them to the federal government or some international body, and they can cut across the rights given to the people by the Constitutional Bill of Rights." Ladies and gentlemen, there isn't a single clause or phrase that's truthful in this quote. And yet, all the lawyers in that meeting applauded him. And a few months later, Dwight David Eisenhower appointed him his Secretary of State. This is one of the reasons why the founder of the John Birch Society and the Society itself criticized Dwight David Eisenhower about some of the people that he was surrounding himself with. And as a result, we got chastised over it because not enough people understood what the Council on Foreign Relations was. They didn't understand the people that were in the government, as such as John Foster Dulles, who before World War II was very involved in Christian socialist circles. Now, the Communist Manifesto, and I want you to read the Communist Manifesto if you never have. You know, Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, admonished us to know our enemy. You can't know your enemy unless you would read what the enemy advocates. So I advocate to everybody, read the Communist Manifesto. Now, it's a preponderous thing from time to time. It's very verbose, and you've got to kind of decipher the things it says, but it's very pointed as to what it's trying to do. Now, when you read the Communist Manifesto, and most people do this, you will center in on 10 steps that Marx and Engels wrote about to bring about a communist state. In other words, they say you need a graduated income tax, you need a Federal Reserve, all that sort of thing in there. And so most people concentrate on that. But what they don't concentrate on is the sentences just before they talk about these steps. And so they outline how they're going to do it. They say this: "In the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order." And this has been the process of the trade agreements. Now let me further elaborate about what they're saying here. First of all, they're saying that they're going to implement things that appear insufficient and untenable so that you don't notice them. But in the process of adopting these solutions to problems that they are trying to get you to adopt, it will necessitate even further inroads. It'll mean that you'll have to do more to solve the problem. And each step makes it worse and demands more. Let me give you an example. Back in the 30s, we had the Great Depression. A lot of people lost everything. The elderly particularly were left out in the cold. There weren't retirement programs in those years, that sort of thing. That was an individual prerogative, and that was a responsibility that everybody was supposed to have. But even those that did do that lost their retirement because everybody lost everything in the Great Depression. So the government came up with a program. We're going to take care of mom and dad. We're going to develop this Social Security program. You'll get a check every month, and that will take care of you during your old age. Don't worry about anything. Now, of course, I always like to ask people if they'd like to retire on Social Security with just that in their pocket, Social Security. You just go from month to month, don't you? It's just paycheck to paycheck, barely making it. And when you get old, when you get up in the morning, you don't quite feel the same as a 25-year-old. And pretty soon you start thinking, maybe I better go to the doctor. And you go to the doctor and guess what? They always find something wrong, right? And then the medical bills start piling up. You can't afford that on Social Security. So we've got a solution for that. It's called Medicare. And that didn't work either. So they gave us Obamacare. And do you think that's going to work? You see, they start something that looks insufficient and untenable, but in the course of the movement outstrips itself and demands further inroads on the old social order. I like to quip, as many people do, that youngsters are all liberals until they get their first paycheck and they look at the taxes and they become conservatives until they get their first Social Security check and they become liberals again. Because who do they support at the polls? The guy that says Social Security is bankrupting the country? Or are they going to support somebody who says, I'm going to protect your Social Security? They become literally wards of the state. That literally is what happens. And necessitates further inroads on the old social order. You see, they've literally taken over the elderly and formed them into a voting bloc through Social Security, haven't they? And Medicare, and now Obamacare. Those are the sorts of things that happen. And this is how they explain how they're going to do it. Very subtle, but it is insidious. Now, the government solutions, again, to a poor economy is free trade, more free trade, universal free trade. First of all, what do we do about this thing? We have to halt the proliferation of so-called trade agreements and then roll back those already in force. It's this, or our economy and our society will be destroyed, and very few people will understand how it was done any more than the Europeans understood how it was done to them. And I always ask the question, would anybody sell their birthright for a good business deal? The Old Testament told us the problem with that with Esau, didn't it? He sold his birthright for a bowl of porridge. And that's the thing that's being held out today, is that bowl of porridge to the business community. They think that they're going to get a better business deal out of these free trade agreements. They don't realize that with it comes the sale of their birthright and the independence of our own country. Secondly, we have to inform ourselves better. We have to educate ourselves as to these problems, the depth and breadth of the trade agreement agenda. And then take these tools that we've produced out into the community to educate others, particularly the businessmen in your community, the opinion molders, the people that make things happen in your community, the Boy Scout leaders, the Kiwanian members, the Chamber of Commerce members, that sort of thing. The people that run your community need to know what's behind all of this. Once they do, they will put pressure on their congressman, your congressman, to vote against these trade agreements. I urge that all of you read my book called International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. It goes into a lot of the things that we've not been able to put into this presentation. It also includes the list of Dr. Lewis, the United Nations treaties, and everything else in it. And so this book will tell just about everything you need to know very quickly. It's an easy read about foreign entanglements. Something else that you can do, particularly if you're active in local groups, is to text the word trade to the number 88588 on your cell phone. You will receive weekly, sometimes twice a week, alerts and updates as to what's going on in this issue. Lastly, you can go to our website, jbs.org, and there you will find an abundance of information on free trade and other things that are of vital interest to the people of the United States at this time. Thank you.